HOA cut my irrigation line. So I showed their $60 million golf course ran on my water what happens when an HOA cuts a private irrigation line without understanding where the water goes. And how could that decision connect to a $60 million golf course? Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I am glad you are here for another unforgettable neighborhood justice story. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Thank you for watching, supporting the channel, and continuing to spend your time with us. Your support truly means a lot. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Let's begin the story. Turn that saw off before you cut through something you do not understand. The reciprocating saw stopped halfway through its next stroke, but the 6-inch irrigation main had already split open beneath the blade. Water hammered into the trench, darkening the pale Texas soil in seconds and carrying loose gravel toward the mini excavator tracks. It was 6:17 in the morning outside Austin, the sky barely orange over Redstone Hills, and I could smell wet limestone dust, diesel exhaust, and fresh-cut pipe before I reached the utility corridor. Todd Brennan stood inside the trench holding the saw. Patricia Caldwell stood above him with a tablet tucked against her side and the satisfied expression of someone who believed a spreadsheet had just solved a problem. "Good," she said. "You are here. We finally removed your illegal irrigation connection." I looked at the open pipe. Water was still pouring from both sides, though the upstream pressure was dropping fast. Illegal according to what? Patricia lifted the tablet. The association utility inventory. This line is not listed as an approved Redstone Hills asset. That was not my question. My name is Daniel Mercer. I was 51 years old, and I had spent nearly 30 years building, repairing, and troubleshooting irrigation, pump, and rural water systems across Central Texas. I knew what a failed pump sounded like before the pressure gauge finished falling. I knew what a clogged screen did to flow. And I knew that buried pipe did not become unauthorized just because somebody failed to put it into a new database. I stepped around the trench without touching anything and walked about 30 feet west to a blue valve box set flush with the ground. I lifted the lid. Inside sat a brass flow meter and a red-handled isolation valve. The meter face was wet with condensation. The register had stopped. Completely. Beside it, the white pressure gauge that normally held steady through the morning irrigation cycle was dropping through 30 pounds per square inch and still falling. Patricia watched me. That equipment is exactly what I mean. Private hardware inside an association utility corridor. Private is not the same as illegal. If we do not own it, it should not be crossing common landscape. Todd climbed out of the trench and wiped mud from his gloves. "Daniel," I asked whether anybody had traced this line before we cut it. Patricia glanced at him. "We traced it far enough to determine it was not on our asset list." I looked toward the west, where the buried main ran back across my 38 acres toward the old well field my father had built before Redstone Hills existed. The faded aluminum identification tag was still wired to the well control panel. I had seen that same number on invoices, pump records, and service logs for years. I took out my phone. Photograph of the cut pipe. Photograph of the trench. Photograph of the blue valve box. Brass meter. Red valve. White pressure gauge. Todd's equipment. Patricia's tablet. Then I photographed the water spreading through the soil. "Planning to file a complaint?" Patricia asked. "Planning to remember exactly what was working before you cut it." She folded her arms. "You can reroute your irrigation on your own property." I looked at the stopped meter again. Something about that bothered me more than the broken pipe. A meter only exists because somebody wants to know how much water is passing through it. And this one had been turning every summer for longer than Patricia had been president. I did not tell her that. Not yet. I closed the blue lid and looked uphill toward Redstone Hills, where the golf course disappeared behind a line of live oaks and limestone walls. The irrigation sprinklers on the nearest fairway were still running from stored pressure, throwing silver arcs into the morning light. Patricia followed my eyes. "What?" "Nothing yet." She had just cut a pipe she could not identify. I wanted to know why the meter stopped before she did. The first thing I checked after Patricia left was not the broken pipe. It was the meter. Water still dripped from the trench behind me, but the brass register under the blue valve lid had stopped at a number I recognized from the week before. That told me the cut had interrupted more than a simple branch line. I pulled a folded service notebook from my truck and compared the reading. Same sequence. Same meter identification. Same upstream pressure reference. The white gauge beside it had fallen below 15 pounds per square inch by then. Normal morning pressure on that side of the system was closer to 68. I photographed the face with my phone, then knelt beside the red-handled isolation valve and left it exactly where it was. I could have started tracing the line physically. I could have shut sections, opened fittings, or dug farther along the corridor. I did none of that. Once somebody creates a property dispute around buried utilities, every wrench becomes evidence. I walked back toward my well field instead. The main line crossed the edge of my 38 acres beneath soil my father had been irrigating long before Redstone Hills had a gatehouse. He had drilled the original well when I was still in high school. The current pump was newer, but the source, easement corridor, and 6-inch main had been part of the property for decades. At the control panel, I wiped dust off the faded aluminum well tag. The stamped identification number was still readable. I photographed it, then checked the pump controller. No fault. No overload. No electrical trip. The well itself was fine. The problem began where Patricia's contractor had cut the main. I had spent nearly 30 years around water systems, and one thing never changed. Pumps lie less than people do. Pressure tells you what is happening right now. Flow tells you what actually moved. Meters tell you who cared enough to measure it. That brass meter bothered me. It had not been installed for my orchard. I did not need a commercial-grade meter to tell myself how much water I was using on my own land. Someone else had needed those numbers. I drove back toward the utility corridor and stopped where the main crossed beneath a strip of landscaped common ground. The blue valve box sat less than 30 feet from the cut. Beyond it, the buried line continued east. I could follow the grade with my eyes, but not the exact route. That would take records. Patricia had made one assumption that morning. Because Redstone Hills did not own the pipe had no legitimate business crossing their landscape. I had a different question. If the line served only me, why did it continue toward them at all? By mid-morning, I found Todd Brennan loading equipment onto his trailer. He looked uncomfortable when I walked over. "You tracing it?" he asked. "Not yet. Patricia said it was abandoned private irrigation." "Did she show you anything proving that?" Todd shook his head. "Just the new utility inventory." "Any old plans?" "No." "Any valve schedule?" "No." "Any meter record?" He looked toward the blue box. "I did not even know that meter was there until you opened it." I nodded. That mattered too. Before leaving, I checked the trench one more time. The water had mostly stopped. The soil around the cut was dark and heavy. Patricia had treated that as proof the problem was finished. To me, it only proved the pressure was gone. I drove home, opened the metal file cabinet in my workshop, and pulled out every old irrigation folder my father had saved. Service tickets, pump curves, hand-drawn sketches, vendor invoices, one laminated schematic with faded colored lines. I spread them across my workbench under the fluorescent lights. Somewhere in that pile was the reason a private meter had been counting water east of my property for years. I just had to find out who had been paying attention to it before Patricia stopped. Patricia trusted a spreadsheet more than she trusted a pipe, and by the end of that week, I understood exactly how that happened. Redstone Hills had recently paid for a full digital inventory of association assets. Irrigation controllers, streetlights, drainage inlets, gate equipment, landscape valves, clubhouse systems. Every item was supposed to have a number, a location, and a maintenance responsibility assigned to it. On paper, that sounded reasonable. The problem started when Patricia decided anything missing from the inventory did not legally belong in the ground. I learned that from Eric Dawson, the golf course superintendent. He called me 2 days after the main was cut. "Daniel, did somebody touch the west irrigation corridor?" Patricia's contractor cut a 6-inch line. Silence. Then, which line? "The one beside the blue valve box." Another pause. "That might be older than the course." "That is what I am trying to prove." Eric lowered his voice. "I warned her there were legacy utilities on that side." "What did she say?" "Legacy means undocumented." I looked across my workshop at the faded plans spread over the bench. "No. Legacy means older than her spreadsheet." Eric gave a tired laugh, but he did not sound amused. He had managed turf long enough to understand that golf courses inherit systems the same way old houses inherit wiring. Some things are newer. Some are patched. Some were installed under agreements nobody remembers until something stops working. "Did your crew notice anything unusual after the cut?" I asked. Nothing major yet. Yet. Pond levels are normal. Main pump station is running. We have stored water. That answer stuck with me. Stored water, not source water. There is a difference. A reservoir can hide a supply interruption for a while, especially if nobody knows what to look for. I did not tell Eric what I suspected because I still could not prove the meter's purpose. That afternoon, Patricia sent a community notice announcing successful removal of an unauthorized private utility from common landscape. She wrote that the utility corridor cleanup project would continue identifying unregistered infrastructure for removal or abandonment. I read the message twice. She had turned one unverified assumption into policy before anyone finished tracing the first pipe. I called her. What document says the line was unauthorized? It was absent from the association asset register. That does not answer the question. Daniel, approved infrastructure is documented. Where? In the inventory. How old is the inventory? Completed this year. How old is Redstone Hills? She paused. That is irrelevant. It is the only relevant thing you have said so far. Her tone cooled. You are welcome to submit evidence that your private irrigation line has a lawful presence in the corridor. I will. Until then, the matter is closed. She disconnected before I could answer. I stood in the workshop listening to the pump controller humming outside and looked down at one of my father's old hand-drawn diagrams. A faded blue line ran east from the well field. The paper was yellow at the edges, and part of the route had been rubbed almost blank from years of folding. Near the margin, he had written one note in pencil. Meter downstream. No customer name. No destination. Just enough to confirm that the brass meter had always been part of something larger than my own irrigation. I photographed the drawing and called Rebecca Sloan. I need help finding every recorded agreement tied to my well and that utility corridor. How far back? She asked. Before the Homeowners Association existed. Rebecca was quiet for a second. Good. Because if Patricia is relying on a current inventory, we should find out what the land was relying on before the inventory was born. That night, I drove past the edge of Redstone Hills as the sun dropped behind the live oaks. The golf course sprinklers were still running. Silver arcs crossed the nearest fairway. Nothing looked wrong. Patricia's spreadsheet still said the pipe had no business being there. The ground, the meter, and 30 years of plumbing history were starting to tell me something else. Patricia put the order in writing before I ever touched a wrench. The certified envelope arrived at my workshop the next morning, and the first line made my jaw tighten harder than the broken pipe had. No excavation, reconnection, valve operation, or repair activity was permitted within the Redstone Hills utility corridor without prior Homeowners Association authorization. The second paragraph warned that any attempt to restore the line could result in daily fines, contractor chargebacks, and legal action for interference with association property. I read it twice, then set it beside the photograph of Todd standing in the trench with my 6-inch main cut open at his feet. Patricia had called the pipe unauthorized when she removed it. Now she was calling the excavation around it association property when she wanted to stop me from fixing it. I called Rebecca Sloan. I can reconnect that main in a few hours. Can you prove who depends on it? She asked. Not yet. Then prove that before you turn a wrench. I looked through the open workshop door toward the well control panel. So I leave it cut. You leave their excavation exactly as they ordered. You document the condition. You preserve the meter reading. You preserve the pressure loss. And you do not give Patricia an argument that you altered anything after notice. I hated waiting when the repair was simple. I had couplings on the shelf. Pipe in the yard. Equipment parked 50 feet away. But Rebecca was right. A mechanical fix could solve the water problem and ruin the evidence problem at the same time. I sent Patricia a written response that afternoon. I stated that the line belonged to me, that it had existed before the current association inventory, that her contractor had cut it without verifying its legal status, and that I remained ready to repair it once access and authority were clarified. She replied within an hour. Do not enter the common corridor or reconnect the line without board approval. I printed that too. Then the first fine appeared in the Redstone Hills owner portal. Unauthorized utility activity. $200. I stared at the wording for a long moment. I had not performed any activity. Their contractor had cut the pipe. My violation was apparently wanting to repair what they had removed. Rebecca told me not to contest the fine emotionally. We will answer the whole theory, not the amount. So I started building the timeline instead. 6:17 in the morning, Main cut. 623. Pressure below 30 pounds per square inch. 640. Meter stopped. 815. Will pump normal. 930. Patricia confirms removal based on asset inventory. Next day, cease and desist received. No reconnection permitted. I added every photograph, every message, and every meter reading. Then Megan Walsh called me. She was the Redstone Hills treasurer, and she sounded confused. Daniel, did you stop water service to the association? No. Patricia says there is a dispute over a private line. Her contractor cut it. Silence. Our contractor? Yes. Why? Because the line was not in the new utility inventory. Megan was quiet long enough that I could hear papers moving on her end. What line was it? That is what I am trying to prove. Do you know where it goes? Not all the way yet. She lowered her voice. I found a recurring irrigation expense with your last name attached to it, but I need to pull older records. I sat straighter. What does it say? Something about supplemental water. Rebecca's voice came back to me immediately. Prove it before you turn a wrench. Do not summarize it, I told Megan. Send Rebecca the original record if you can. After the call, I walked outside and opened the blue valve box one more time. The brass meter was still frozen on the same number. The white pressure gauge sat nearly dead. The red-handled valve remained exactly where it had been before Patricia's crew arrived. I closed the lid without touching anything. The repair was still simple. The reason not to repair it had just become much more interesting. The record Megan found was not a maintenance invoice. It was a check stub. Supplemental irrigation water, Mercer supply agreement. I was standing in Rebecca's office when she slid the scanned copy across the table, and for a second I just stared at my last name printed beneath 12 years of Redstone Hills accounting history. That is not one payment, she said. Megan found a recurring series. She opened another file. Then another. Spring. Summer. Early fall. Different amounts, same description. Supplemental irrigation water. Mercer Supply. Redstone Hills Golf Club. My father's name appeared on the oldest records. Mine appeared after I took over the property and well system. I leaned back slowly. They have been paying for this water? Rebecca nodded. For at least 12 years in the records Megan has recovered. Then why did nobody tell Patricia? Because accounting and asset management are not the same thing. Somebody paid the bills. Somebody else built the new utility inventory. She reached for a thicker folder. And this is the part that matters more. Inside was the original supplemental irrigation water agreement signed years before Patricia became president. My father had signed for the Mercer property. The original Redstone developer had signed for the golf operation. The language was plain enough that even Patricia's spreadsheet could not improve it. The well remained privately owned. The upstream 6-inch main remained privately owned. Redstone Hills received a contractual right to purchase supplemental irrigation water through a metered connection. The agreement described the brass meter, the isolation assembly, the pressure requirements, and the permitted branch serving golf irrigation pond number 2. I looked at Rebecca. So that meter was not measuring my orchard. No, it was measuring their water. Water they were buying from your source. I felt the entire morning of the pipe cut rearrange itself in my head. Patricia standing over the trench. Todd holding the saw. Her telling me the line was private as if that settled everything. She had been right about the ownership and completely wrong about what ownership meant. The pipe was mine. The water source was mine. The agreement was theirs. Megan joined us by telephone and read the accounting descriptions from the association system. Every summer, the golf operation had paid for supplemental volume according to meter readings. Some years were heavier, some lighter. Drought years stood out immediately. Rebecca asked, "Do you have the current meter identification?" I pulled up the photograph from that morning. Brass face. Serial number. Same sequence printed in the old agreement. Then I showed her the faded aluminum tag from the well control panel. Same source identifier. Rebecca placed both photographs beside the contract. That closes the loop. I was still looking at the payment history when Megan said, "Daniel, I checked last year's budget. The water expense is still there." Under what department? Golf operations. That was the first time I said it out loud. They cut my irrigation line. Rebecca corrected me without changing her tone. No, they cut their water supply. The pipe just happens to belong to you. The sentence sat there for a second. Clean. Mechanical. Almost funny if the consequences had not already started moving uphill. I called Eric Dawson immediately. Check pond number 2. Why? Because I found the agreement. Silence. What agreement? The golf course has been buying supplemental water from my well for 12 years. Eric stopped speaking. Then I heard a chair scrape on his end. You are serious. Dead serious. That 6-inch line. Yes. The one Patricia cut. Yes. He exhaled hard. I am going to the pond now. 20 minutes later, he called back. It is down. How much? About 3 inches from where I logged it last week. Pump station normal? Running. Any main pressure complaints yet? Not yet. I looked at the cut pipe photograph still open on Rebecca's screen. Stored water had been covering Patricia's mistake exactly the way Eric said it might. The golf course had not stopped working when the line was cut. It had simply started spending what it had left. By the following afternoon, the pond was down another inch. Eric Dawson sent me a photograph from Gulf Irrigation Pond number 2 with a measuring staff visible near the pump intake. The water line had dropped enough to expose a pale ring along the bank that had been underwater the week before. Still running, he told me over the phone. But the transfer schedule is getting tighter. Outside, Central Texas had settled into the kind of August heat that makes every metal surface feel hotter than it looks. The afternoon temperature was pushing past 100 degrees, and the fairways at Redstone Hills were drinking water faster than the ponds could recover without supplemental flow. Eric had already adjusted the irrigation program twice. Greens first, tees second, fairway edges reduced, rough zones cut back. Nothing dramatic yet, just the quiet math of having less water than the system was designed to expect. I drove past the west side of the course near sunset and saw the first visible change along a distant fairway. Not brown, not dead, just lighter. The outer edge had gone from deep green to a pale, dusty color that stood out against the center strip. The sprinklers were still running in clean silver arcs, but the pattern looked thinner farther from the pump station. I called Eric. Pressure. Down at the outer zones during peak cycle. How much? Enough that I am staggering heads that normally run together. Pump issue. No. Pump is fine. Pond level is the problem. That matched everything I expected. Irrigation systems do not fail all at once when supply disappears. They adapt badly first. A reservoir drops. Pump runtime increases. Pressure becomes less stable at the farthest zones. Coverage suffers around the edges. Then somebody blames the weather because the weather is visible and the missing supply line is buried. Patricia did exactly that. The next morning, she sent a board message blaming extreme seasonal conditions for temporary turf stress and assuring residents that golf operations remained normal. Eric forwarded it to me with one sentence. Heat is why we need the supplemental water. I printed that too. Not because the heat was irrelevant. It was the opposite. The hotter it got, the more important the old agreement became. Rebecca told me to keep documenting without interfering. Patricia's cease and desist still prohibited me from entering the common corridor or reconnecting the main. The fine remained on my account. So every morning, I checked the blue valve box from my side of the permitted access point. Brass meter still stopped. White pressure gauge still nearly dead. Red-handled isolation valve untouched. Every afternoon, Eric recorded pond number 2. 3 inches low became 5. 5 became a little more after another dry day. The golf pump station began running longer cycles to maintain storage. One evening, Eric called while I was eating dinner. I have got complaints from the back 9. What kind? Weak coverage at the far heads. Uneven arcs. A couple of dry spots along the 11th fairway. Any mechanical fault? Not one I can find. Then what are you doing? Prioritizing greens and tees. Cutting non-essential zones. I looked through the kitchen window toward my well field. The pump system on my side was sitting quiet because the downstream connection Patricia had cut was still open to nowhere. How long can you stretch stored water? I asked. Eric hesitated. Long enough to make this somebody's problem before it becomes the course's problem. That answer told me he understood exactly where we were. The next day, I drove past the clubhouse after a contractor meeting and saw 2 maintenance carts parked beside the 12th fairway. Eric was standing near a patch of pale turf, one hand on his hip, looking toward the irrigation pond. Patricia was beside him. Even from the road, I could see her pointing toward the sky as if 100-degree heat explained everything. Maybe to her, it did. But weather had not cut the line. Heat had not signed a stop work order. Drought had not told me not to reconnect the pipe. The course was not collapsing. It was simply losing the cushion that had hidden her mistake. and every inch the pond dropped made the old brass meter under my blue valve lid harder to ignore. Thomas Reed unfolded the original irrigation schematic across Rebecca's conference table and pinned the corners down with a legal pad, a coffee mug, and 2 thick contract folders. He had spent more than 25 years designing golf irrigation systems across Texas, and unlike Patricia's utility inventory, his drawing had elevations, flow assumptions, pipe sizes, pump capacities, and source connections marked in ink that had faded but never disappeared. I stood beside him while he traced a red line from the western edge of Redstone Hills toward Golf Irrigation Pond Number 2. Here, he said, this is the supplemental feed. His finger moved across the sheet. 6-inch main, meter assembly, pressure regulator, pond connection. Then the red line ended at a small square symbol beside the utility corridor. Thomas looked at the photograph on my phone. Blue valve lid, brass meter, same location. That is your box. I nodded. And that line is the one Patricia cut. He looked at me, then back at the drawing. Then she disconnected a documented supply source. Rebecca leaned over the table. How important is that source to the golf course? Thomas did not exaggerate. It is not the only water source. The course has stored irrigation water and other inflows. But the design assumes supplemental summer volume from the Mercer system. In prolonged heat, that supply materially supports pond recovery and peak irrigation demand. That was the sentence I had been waiting for. Not that every blade of grass depended on my well. Not that the whole course would fail overnight. Something better because it was true. Their $60 million golf property had been designed with my water as part of its operating capacity. Thomas pulled out another sheet showing expected demand. Look at the summer calculations. The base sources handle normal conditions. The supplemental line reduces drawdown during peak use. He circled a number with his pencil. Take this away during a hot, dry stretch, and the ponds fall faster than they recover. Then the pump station starts stretching stored volume. Eric Dawson joined us by telephone and confirmed exactly that. Pond number 2 was more than 5 inches below his earlier log. The outer fairway zones were being staggered. Greens and tees had priority. Pump runtime had increased. Patricia's cut had not stopped the course. It had made the entire irrigation system work harder for every gallon it still had. Rebecca placed the supplemental irrigation water agreement beside the schematic. Then Megan Walsh's 12 years of payment records. Then Patricia's cease and desist letter ordering me not to reconnect the line. For stacks of paper. One story. I am sending the final demand today, Rebecca said. The letter was simple. Restore access for professional repair of the privately owned main. Withdraw the fine. Honor the existing water agreement. Reimburse the documented repair cost. Preserve every work order and utility inventory record used to authorize the cut. Patricia answered before 5 that afternoon. She insisted Redstone Hills could secure water from other sources and accused us of overstating the importance of one private line. Eric called me 10 minutes later. She told the board City Water can replace you. Can it? Not without new infrastructure, approvals, operating cost, and a different way of filling the pond. How fast? He laughed once without humor. Not before this summer gets hotter. I drove out to the blue valve box before sunset. The red-handled valve was still untouched. The white gauge was almost flat. The brass meter remained frozen at the exact reading from the morning Todd cut the main. I lifted the old laminated schematic Rebecca had copied for me and held it beside the open box. The red line on the drawing ended exactly where my boots were standing. Patricia had spent weeks saying the pipe was undocumented because her spreadsheet could not see it. The original engineers had drawn it in red before her inventory even existed. Rebecca called as I closed the lid. Board meeting tomorrow night. Did their attorney get the documents? All of them. I looked across the live oaks toward the pale edge of the distant fairway. Good. The argument had finally reached the point where nobody needed to guess where the water came from. We had the contract, the checks, the pond logs, and one red line ending under one blue lid. Patricia brought the new utility inventory to the board meeting like it was the last word on the subject. Rebecca brought 12 years of payments, the original water agreement, the irrigation schematic, and a folder thick enough to make the inventory look temporary. The Redstone Hills clubhouse was cold from overworked air conditioning, and every chair along the back wall was occupied. Megan Walsh sat near the treasurer's station with printed accounting records stacked in chronological order. Eric Dawson had pond logs and pump reports. Thomas Reed stood beside a large engineering sheet rolled across the conference table. Patricia opened first. The line was not listed as an association asset. It crossed common landscape. We removed unauthorized infrastructure. Rebecca did not interrupt. She waited until Patricia finished describing the utility corridor cleanup project, the current asset database, and the board's supposed responsibility to eliminate undocumented utilities. Then she slid one document toward the association attorney. Supplemental Irrigation Water Agreement. The attorney adjusted his glasses and read. Silence stretched across the room. Rebecca placed the next stack beside it. Payment history. Megan took over. I verified these records myself. Redstone Hills has paid for supplemental irrigation water from the Mercer system for 12 consecutive years. She read several entries aloud. Same description. Different summer amounts. Same source. Patricia leaned forward. Payments do not make the pipe an association asset. I looked at her. Correct. She stopped. Rebecca almost smiled. That is actually the point. Thomas unrolled the original irrigation schematic. His finger followed the red line from the Mercer well system through the 6-inch main, brass flow meter, and pressure assembly toward Gulf Irrigation Pond Number 2. This connection was part of the documented irrigation design. The Gulf operation did not own the source line. It purchased supplemental water through it. Eric opened his logbook. Since the line was cut, Pond Number 2 has continued dropping. Pump runtime has increased. We have reduced irrigation in lower priority zones and staggered coverage on the outer fairways. Patricia turned toward him. The heat caused that. Eric nodded. The heat increased demand. The missing supplemental supply reduced recovery. Both statements can be true. The association attorney looked at Patricia's inventory again. When was this database created? This year. And the water agreement? Rebecca answered. Long before the current board system existed. He looked back down at the papers. Then absence from the new asset inventory does not establish that the infrastructure was unauthorized. Patricia's voice sharpened. If the association did not own the line, why was it allowed in our corridor? Rebecca pointed to the recorded agreement and easement documents. Because ownership and lawful use are not the same thing. I finally spoke. You cut the line because it was not yours. Patricia looked at me. Exactly. I nodded once. That was the one part you got right. The room went completely still. The pipe was never yours. The well was never yours. The meter was never yours. You were paying to use water moving through equipment my family owned before your spreadsheet existed. Megan closed her payment folder. The attorney picked up Patricia's cease and desist letter. And after the association cut the line, Mr. Mercer was instructed not to repair it. Pending authorization, Patricia said. Then the association cannot reasonably penalize him for leaving the system disconnected after ordering him not to reconnect it. He recommended immediate withdrawal of every utility-related fine, written authorization for professional repair, reimbursement of repair costs, and suspension of any further utility removal work until legacy agreements were reviewed. Megan made the motion. Another board member seconded it. The vote passed. Then came a second motion removing Patricia from authority over infrastructure and utility projects pending a policy review. That passed too. Patricia stared at the inventory on her tablet, while Thomas's old red line remained stretched across the table in front of her. 12 years of checks had been louder than her title, and one pipe she called undocumented had more history than the system she used to erase it. The meter started moving again on a Thursday morning. Todd Brennan came back with a licensed irrigation crew, Thomas Reed's marked-up schematic, and written authorization from both the association and Rebecca. This time nobody brought a saw until the line had been isolated, measured, and confirmed. They excavated the damaged section, cut back to clean pipe, installed the proper repair coupling, pressure-tested the connection, and checked the branch-feeding Gulf Irrigation Pond Number 2. I stood beside the blue valve box while Thomas watched the white pressure gauge. Ready? He asked. I nodded. Todd opened the red-handled isolation valve slowly. The needle climbed. 20 pounds per square inch. 40. 55. Then it settled near the range I had been seeing all summer before the cut. Beneath it, the brass flow meter hesitated for 1 second and began turning. Quiet little clicks. Nothing dramatic. Just water moving through equipment that had never forgotten what it was built to do. Eric Dawson called me that afternoon. Pond is recovering. How fast? enough that I can put the outer fairways back on a normal rotation by the weekend. The next morning, the pale edges along the 11th and 12th fairways were still visible, but the course was no longer rationing every irrigation cycle. The greens stayed protected. The tees held color. The pond level stopped falling. Nobody had to sacrifice $60 million of golf property to prove a point. That mattered to me. I had never wanted the course damaged. I wanted the people managing it to understand what they had cut before they cut it. Redstone Hills adopted a new infrastructure policy 2 weeks later. No buried utility could be removed, capped, abandoned, or relocated until the board checked recorded easements, legacy agreements, engineering plans, and ownership records. Anything older than the current asset inventory had to be researched instead of erased. Megan sent me the final policy with one sentence attached. Legacy does not mean undocumented. I laughed when I read it. Patricia stayed on the board until the next election, but she did not stay president. The vote was not close. Eric told me later that most residents were less angry about the temporary turf stress than they were about the fact that the association had spent money cutting a privately owned line it had been paying to use for 12 years. I never celebrated her loss. Titles come and go. Water agreements last as long as the paper says they do. By early September, I drove past Redstone Hills at sunset and watched the sprinklers sweep across the fairways in long silver arcs. The live oaks were black against the orange sky. Golf irrigation pond number 2 reflected the last light, and the pump station hummed steadily near the bank. On my way home, I stopped at the west utility corridor and lifted the blue valve lid. The brass meter was moving. The white pressure gauge held steady. The red-handled valve was exactly where it belonged. The faded aluminum well tag still carried the same identification number my father had written into records decades earlier. None of those things had changed because Patricia built a spreadsheet. None of them had needed to. She thought the pipe had to belong to the Homeowners Association before it could matter. She learned the opposite when $60 million of golf course started waiting for water from a line that had belonged to me all along.